Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to look at this topic about gross domestic product. I'm going to divide my lecture on gross domestic product into two parts. So I'm just starting part one of this lecture. In this two-part lecture series, I will talk about how to define gross domestic product or GDP and show how it can be calculated by using various approaches. Then I will show how to calculate real GDP, which is another way of looking at the economic activity by controlling for the price movements from one year to another year. And then we are going to talk about the various limitations of GDP as a measure of economic activity. We will conclude this chapter by trying to distinguish between two concepts called potential GDP and the actual real GDP. That will be mainly in the second lecture. So in the first lecture, we are mainly going to cover the first two, at least the first one, define gross domestic product and the various ways of calculating the GDP. So let's start with the definition of GDP. The definition of GDP or gross domestic product are one of those definitions which I call loaded, in the sense that every word in the definition is important. So if you look at the definition of gross domestic product, GDP is nothing but the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. Let's now look at various components of these three parts. So when we talk about the market value of all goods and services, we are basically talking about market prices of those goods and services. We believe that market price in a efficiently operating market really reflect the true value of the goods and services in question. When we say the word of all, we are basically talking about all the goods and services produced legally inside of a country. When we talk about the issue legal, we are obviously ignoring goods that are produced and sold illegally. We are also ignoring, and that's a very important limitations of our GDP concept, is that we ignore or exclude goods and services that are produced at home and consumed at home. Then the word final is important, because when we are going to calculate GDP, we are going to ignore the so-called intermediate goods, or sometimes they call it raw materials, and sometimes, so the intermediate goods are goods that are that are used to produce the final goods. So if you think about, let's say, a car, and the tire of a car is a good itself, but the tire of a car is basically the intermediate good in the production of a car. Now it might sometimes raise confusion, because for Michelin, that only produces tires are basically their final product. So when we are calculating the value of the car, we are theoretically not supposed to include the value of the tire, because the value of the car already includes the value of the tires. More on that later. Then the second important word is the goods and services, which means that we are going to include both tangible goods that you can see, and intangible services like a haircut. Then the word production is very important, because we are going to always be interested in figuring out how the production of an economy is changing over time. So we need to get a good idea about the idea of production. We are going to look at the production of only new goods and services that are produced, inside the country. Now that takes us to the next concept, which is called within the country, meaning that GDP will be considered for a geographical location, so a geographical boundary. So every time we are going to be looking at GDP, we are going to be interested in looking at how much goods and services has been produced within the boundary of that country. And finally, by the way, the nationality of the producer is not important when you think about GDP. So if you think about an immigrant worker working in a plant in Ohio and producing something, that obviously contributes to GDP. So in a given period of time is kind of straightforward. Sometimes we use like a yearly measurement of GDP, and sometimes we resort to like a quarterly measurement. Okay, so let's now look at an example, a very simple example of how some goods that are in question could be part of GDP and some goods not. So look at the question that I'm looking at. So the question is asking you which of the following would not be counted in 2013's GDP. So notice that there is a specific mentioning about the time. When you look at A, it says the value of a 2008 boat you purchased from a boat dealer in 2013. You should understand that this boat was created or produced in 2008, and the value of the boat was already included in 2008's GDP calculation. So the value of the 2008 boat is obviously not part of 2013's GDP. So the correct answer is A. But let us look at other options as well. So B, the 2013 salary of a used motorcycle salesperson. Used motorcycles are not part of GDP because they are used goods, they are not new or final. And but the person who is selling those goods, the used cars, are getting a salary because the salesperson is providing a service to the prospective buyer. So, and that service is brand new, and by definition those services are going to be counted in GDP calculation. So in order to proxy for that, we take a look at the salary of the salesperson. C, the commission earned by a real estate agent in selling condominiums built prior to 2013. Again, the same problem. The condominiums were built before 2013, and hence they are not part of the GDP calculation of 2013, but the person who is selling those condominiums is providing a service, and the value of that service has to be part of GDP. D, the value of a refrigerator manufactured in 2013 but not sold in 2013. This is a tricky one, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. This kind of situation where you produce something and you don't sell that good in that year is called an inventory. And for reasons that are quite important, we are going to show and see that this kind of inventory are part of the GDP calculation in the year that it was produced. So this refrigerator was produced in 2013, although it was not sold in 2013, it should still be part of the 2013's GDP calculation. So that's our example. Let's now move on to the next topic, where we are going to start looking at various ways of coming up with this number GDP, which is an extremely important number because GDP gives you an idea about how much new production of goods and services are taking place inside of an economy. And this particular measurement of goods and services are kind of important because it tells you where the country is. Before we look at various approaches of calculating GDP, I would like to talk to you a little bit about this idea of value addition. This is actually a very intuitive way of figuring out how GDP should be calculated, or what is the ideal way of calculating GDP. Now, if you think about what we are trying to do here, we are trying to figure out how much output is being produced in a given economy. And the best thing would be to figure out, first identify all the firms in an economy, and figure out how much each of the firms are producing. But the problem is that some of these producers are intermediate good producer, like the tire producer who contributes to the production of car as an intermediate good. So what we need to do is we need to figure out something called value addition or value added. What does that mean? Value addition is the amount of output that a firm contributes to the production of a good, of a final good. So the best way to think about value addition is to think about a good that goes through several stages of production, right? You can think about a car having been going through several stages of production. A car is a very complex example. The one that I am going to talk about is like an oil extraction example, and I think it's simple enough to give us a good idea about what this value addition means. Imagine oil production, right? The gasoline that you buy from your local gas station, right? That oil probably goes through 4 fundamental stages of production. The first stage is what we call the drilling, where the driller drills the oil out of the from the earth, and then he sells that to the refinery. The refinery refines that oil and sells that to the sort of like a wholesaler. The wholesaler buys those gasoline and then sells that to the retailer. So there are 4 different stages. Now at each different stage, the producer in that stage definitely contributes something to the value of the good, right? So that's what we mean by value addition. So if we look at an artificial example that is in your slide, you can think about the oil driller really drilling $3 worth of oil from the earth. So this is crude oil, and just for the sake of argument, let's assume that the value of that crude oil is about $3. So since our oil driller is the primary producer, the first stage of producer, whatever he produces is a contribution or value addition to the economy. So he drills $3 worth of oil and sells that to our oil refinery. So our oil refinery buys that crude oil, purifies that, and sells that to the shipper for the $3.30. So notice that out of this $3.30, $3 was the value addition by the previous stage producer. So our retailer basically contributes to that extra 30-cent dollar worth of services or value, whatever you want to call it. So the value addition by the refinery is about 30 cents. So the refinery refines that oil and then sells that oil to the shipping corporation. And the shipping corporation or the wholesaler sells that and buys that good for $3.30 from the refinery, and then sells that to the retailers for about $3.60. So you can imagine clearly that the wholesaler also contributes a little bit of service to the GDP, which is about 30 cents again, $3.60 minus $3.30. Now, when the retailer buys this gasoline from the wholesaler, the retailer sells that gasoline for $4 to a buyer at the gas station. So he bought that gasoline for $3.60 and he sold that for $4. So you can see clearly that our retailer is also contributing about 40 cents worth of new services to the economy. When we add up all these different value additions, $3 by our driller, 30 cents by our refinery, 30 cents by our wholesaler, and then 40 cents by our retailer, we see that the total value addition is $4. Now that would be the perfect and ideal way of calculating GDP, by identifying the value addition of each of the producers in an economy. Unfortunately, some production process is so complicated that it is nearly impossible to come up with value addition for each stage of production. So that sort of forces us to think about alternative ways of calculating GDP. One important key is to see that the market value at the end from the end producer who is selling that to the market is $4, which is also equal to the value addition made by each firms in this production process. So this is a strong intuition that sometimes rather than finding out value addition by each firm, we simply go to the market and see the final price of the final good that is being sold, and we believe that that final price really reflects the value addition made by each producer in each stages of producing that good. So that will be our intuition. That also gives you an idea as to why we focus on the market price and the market value of the goods that we are trying to add to the GDP calculation. So with that sort of like a prelude to how we are going to calculate GDP, let us now switch our attention towards finding out the GDP, various ways of calculating GDP. Now, the idea of GDP is very fundamental, and it is a philosophical concept. If you look at the definition of GDP, you would realize that GDP is trying to give you an idea about how much economic activity are taking place. And from our previous chapters, we have learned that almost all active economic activities can be explained by this so-called circular flow diagram, where you can see how firms and households interact, and how the what is produced in the economy is being consumed or bought by various agents of the economy. Now, if you just focus on the final goods market, then because that's where the GDP calculation is relevant, you'd realize that there are basically two players in that market, right? There are these buyers and there are these sellers. Sellers are selling this good to our buyer, and our buyer is buying them from the income that our buyer is basically getting by working as a laborer for the firm in the factory market. So in the output market, the expenditure made by various agents of our economy, which is spent on the goods and services that are being produced in the economy, are also equal to the income of these agents, right? So therefore one could think about two ways of approximating GDP, right? The best one would have been trying to directly estimate the total production according to the value added approach, which is theoretically not possible. So the alternative way is to figure out what is the total income of the economy and then get an idea about how much production is taking place from that concept, or figuring out how much expenditure is being carried out by various agents of the economy, because we believe that the expenditures made by everyone are spent on goods that were produced. So from a philosophical perspective, expenditure made by everyone in the economy should be equal to the GDP of the economy. So that's what this particular slide is talking about. We can therefore think about having calculating GDP by finding out the total amount of expenditures made in the economy, and that approach is going to be called like an expenditure approach. And then we can also think about various ways of finding the total income of the economy, and those if we can find those income and we add them, the GDP that we're going to calculate is going to be a GDP where the method is going to be called the income approach. So to be more specific, we are going to calculate GDP by using two alternative approaches, the expenditure approach and the income approach. Okay, let's look at the most common and the most extensive form of way of calculating GDP. What you're looking at right now is called an expenditure approach, where in this approach, GDP is the sum of expenditures on final goods and services purchased by our households, investors, government, and foreigners. So there are these four different kind of expenditure: expenditure by households, expenditure made by investors, whom we are going to call firm in a minute, government, and foreigners. In the expenditure approach, GDP is calculating by using this very simple formula where Y is the GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, where C is consumption, private consumption, I is investment, G is government expenditure or purchase, and NX is net export. Let's explore each of these concepts. Let's first look at consumption. Consumption, in many aspects, is the most important and most important concept component of our GDP. Consumption or C is the spending by households on goods and services. This spending could be on various things, like it could be spending on durable goods like a car, spending on non-durable goods like milk, or spending on a service like a haircut by our household. One word of caution is that spending buying a house could seem like spending on durable goods, but houses are not part of consumption expenditures. They are conceptually part of investment expenditures, which we are going to look at next. So C is the expenditure made by households. The next expenditure is called investment, probably the most important macroeconomic concepts from a macro perspective. Investment is the spending on capital, equipment, inventories, and structures by firms. So they are called investment expenditures because they are investment expenditure made by firms. When we think about where does our firm spend their money on, we realize that they spend their money on basically buying three things. First is called a business fixed investment, which is expenditures on machines and capital goods like the stuff that the machines that they use in the production process. The second is called residential investment, which is basically firms buying houses. Now we have to be careful that firms also buy houses. They like rent a rental place where they set up their business. So that's obviously some expenditure on housing. But in order to emphasize the role of housing, we are going to also look at include housing purchased by consumers as part of residential investment. So if you are a household and you just bought a house, your house is not included in consumption expenditure. Your house is considered residential investment and it is included in the investment expenditures. The last one is kind of critical. It's called changes in business inventory. Let's try to understand what inventory is. Inventory is our unsold new goods. What does that mean? It means that, let's say in 2015, GM produced 50,000 cars and they were able to sell only 40,000. So what do they do with the remaining 10,000 cars that they were not able to sell? The answer is that they usually put that up in a sort of storage place. In their accounting system, this storage is called inventory. You have to understand that these goods that we just talked about, they were goods that were produced. So they are new goods. So theoretically, they should be part of GDP. The problem with inventory is that inventory are actually unsold goods. So what do you do? And our definition tells us that if you have a good that is produced and that is sold in the market, only then it should be included in the GDP calculation. So inventory are goods that were produced but not sold. So in order to maintain consistency, economists assign a market value for those unsold cars, meaning that they assume at what prices those cars could be sold, and take that market value of those cars in their inventory, and that inventory shows up as part of investment expenditures. So as firms, even if you cannot sell some of the stuff that you produced, they should still be part of the GDP calculation. I think this gives you a very clear idea as to how important inventory is. Okay, so inventory accumulation would be a way to understand that firms are adding unsold goods to the economy, but that means that economic production is going up as well. The next candidate is called government purchase. Government purchase are are expenditures made by government. Now, I want to take a moment, take a couple of moments to really explain it to you what the role of the government is in our GDP calculation. So, government in an economy basically acts like a household and a farm at the same time. Think about it, right? Government sometimes buys milk like you and I. If they want to create like a relief fund, government buys other stuff from the marketplace just like you and me. So government is basically a kind of a consumer. Government also invests in the economy, right? Government builds roads, government builds infrastructures. Those infrastructures are could be spending on fixed investment, business fixed. They could be business fixed investment. Government could build infrastructures like this university that you're looking at. It's a government creating a house, right? So that's also like an investment. So when we think about government expenditure or government purchases, or to put it shortly, G, we are basically looking at government consumption and government investment. Now, having said that, the concept of government is multi-layered, right? I mean, in an economy like USA, there is a federal level government, there is a state level government, and there is a community or local level government. And our G includes expenditures by government at every level. Okay. One important word of caution is that transfer payments, which are a major part of government expenditure. Transfer payments such as unemployment benefit, free medical insurance, all this stuff are not part of the GDP calculation. They are not part of G to begin with, and they are not part of the GDP. This, I think, raises one of the most important confusion in calculating GDP. So let's say I am a household and I'm a consumer and I don't have a job and I get some kind of unemployment benefit from the government. I use that to buy stuff from the market. How come that transfer payment made by the government to me is not part of the GDP calculation? The answer is fairly philosophical. Imagine how the government is making those transfer payments. When government gives you free medical insurance or unemployment benefit, most of the times those are funds that the government has accrued or collected by imposing tax on people who has a job, right? So government basically through these transfer payments takes money away from the rich or working class and gives it to the non-working class, people who are not working. So government actually is doing kind of Robin Hood kind of stuff, right? Robin Hood kind of activity. So if that is the reason, then these transfer payments basically are not creating any new goods. They are basically changing hands, right? So this income that are becoming part of the income of a unemployed person was part of my income, and I paid that as a tax, and that tax is being used to give this transfer payment to this homeless person or unemployed person or this retired person. So transfer payments are basically not part of the new economic activities, and hence they should not be part of GDP calculation. So we covered C, we covered I, we covered G. NX or net export is pretty straightforward. Net export is basically exports minus imports, and exports are goods that you sell to foreigners, import are goods that you buy from foreigners. So that's a very straightforward concept. Now, you can basically look at this very interesting modified circular flow diagram to really get an idea about how or why the expenditure approach makes sense in calculating GDP. So if you think about the goods market, which is this market, there is an interaction from the government, there is an interaction from the household, it's C, interaction from the government is G, there are interaction from the firm, that's also like an I. There can be financial firms that can also invest in these markets. So all of the activities in the goods market really capture the focal point of economic activity. So if you figure out how money is being spent on this goods market from the rest of the world, from the financial market, from the government, from the household, from the firms, you really can calculate GDP. And that's what the expenditure approach of GDP does. Now, we have to be very careful about looking at the expenditure approach. Expenditure approach excludes four major categories of expenditures that we regularly carry out. First of all, when we buy a used good, the value of that good is not part of GDP calculation. So even if I buy an old house today and I live on that house is not part of the GDP calculation. Financial assets. And I think the financial asset may kind of make sense. I mean, government GDP is trying to measure the value of real goods and services, real production of goods and services. And financial resources like money or stocks and bonds really does not contribute to the production of any goods and services. So although the financial market is pretty important, and the financial transactions like holding money, buying stocks and bonds are important expenditures that we carry out, they are not part of the GDP calculation. The next one is home production. I think we mentioned that before. Let's just explain that again one more time. If you have a home production like making a pizza by yourself and eating that pizza, or you are providing a service at home like raising your child or providing child service, these are not part of the GDP calculation because simply they are not traded in the marketplace. They don't really have a market value. So from a philosophical perspective, home production is not part of GDP calculation. The final one is this idea that underground economic activities are not included in the GDP calculation, and I think it makes perfect sense. Underground economy are economy that is selling illegal goods. Now we have to be careful about defining what an illegal good is. Now, when we think about underground economy, we usually think about drugs, human trafficking and things like that. But think again. Let's say you are a street vendor who is selling burgers to customers, but you don't actually have a government license, meaning that you don't pay tax. So although the good that you're selling is, burger, it's innocent, it's not illegal. The way you are selling those goods is illegal. You are not paying government any tax. You don't have like a permit to sell that. So from that perspective, these economic activities which are part of the underground economy are not part of the GDP calculation. Okay, now let us quickly look at an example before we conclude our lecture number 1. So we have an example of information that is provided to you. Expenditure on durable goods, non-residential investment, and a lot of information, and you are asked to calculate gross domestic product. As we are going to mention this several times, that the basic approach of calculating GDP really depends on the availability of information. Based on the expenditure approach, we know that if we can figure out the expenditure of various components of the economy like C, I, G, and NX, we should be able to calculate GDP by using the expenditure approach. So let's first identify C. C is going to be durable goods, expenditure on durable goods, expenditure on non-durable goods, and then expenditure of services. So once we add these three, C is durable expenditure, non-durable services. So you add 800, 700, and services 500. So that's your C, expenditure on consumption expenditure. Then I is residential investment expenditure, which is non-residential investment by firm, residential investment by firm, and then there is this change in business inventory. So you add these three numbers, 50, 400, and you subtract 25 because there is a negative number, you calculate I. Now government expenditure is basically straightforward. It's federal government purchase of goods and services, so that's the government expenditure at the federal level. Then state and local purchase of goods and services, that's government purchases at the state and local level. So you add those two up, you get government expenditure. Now it is given that your export is 400, import is 250, so you can calculate, you can simply add export and subtract import from the other components. So you just add C, I, G, and export, and you subtract import, and what you get is a number 3,750, and that's what your GDP calculation is. One interesting question is, however, why do we subtract investment, import? Why not simply just ignore import? The importance of subtracting import is because these imported goods, This could be a wine that shows up in consumption expenditure. This could be a foreign machine that shows up in I. This could be a foreign fighter plane that the government purchased that shows up in G. So in order to get an idea about how much the economy, the country itself is producing, we have to subtract those imported goods from C, I, and G. And it's very difficult to do that separately. So what we do, we find out how much the country imported and we subtract that number from the rest of the numbers and we get GDP by using the expenditure approach. Thank you very much. That concludes our first part of the lecture. We're going to come back to the second part in a minute.